When a seasoned school photographer, Elias Thorne, accustomed to the fleeting smiles and restless energy of children during the annual chaos of Picture Day, notices one little boy, Thomas, resolutely refusing to take off his worn baseball cap. It is, initially, a minor, albeit stubborn, frustration in a tightly scheduled morning at Northwood Elementary. This wasn't merely the shyness Elias often encountered. It was a silent, adamant defiance, the boy's small, surprisingly strong hands clutching the faded brim as if it were the only solid thing in his precarious world. His eyes, wide and startlingly dark, darting around the makeshift gymnasium studio with a hunted look that seemed far too old, too weary, for his tender 7 or 8 years. The boy's unwavering insistence, a silent ritual Elias had peripherally observed even in the days leading up to Picture Day as he set up his equipment, felt like a heavy, unarticulated secret being held just out of sight, a palpable tension radiating from the child's small, hunched frame. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe every child deserves to be seen and protected, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. For several tense minutes, Elias Thorne, a man who prided himself on his ability to coax even the most reticent child into a fleeting moment of photographic cooperation, tried his repertoire of gentle coaxing, practiced reassurances, and even a silly face or two, the usual reliable tricks of his long-practiced trade, until he finally saw a raw, visceral flash of terror in the child's eyes, a momentary glimpse of an abyss of fear, and then, almost simultaneously, a faint, dark, purplish yellow discoloration peeking ominously from beneath the cap's frayed edge that changed everything in an instant. Elias had spent 3 decades capturing the ephemeral moments of childhood, his lens a silent, impartial witness to countless scraped knees, gap-toothed grins, triumphant school play poses, and the occasional tearful protest over a disliked outfit or a stubborn cowlick. His studio downtown, a sanctuary of controlled light and quiet anticipation, felt worlds away from the noisy, vibrant chaos of school picture days. Yet it was here, in these bustling, temporary setups, that he often felt most connected to the pulse of life. Today, however, the familiar, brightly lit gymnasium, usually a place of playful energy, felt charged with an unspoken dread, the cheerful blue backdrop a stark contrast to the growing, terrible suspicion coiling in Elias's gut. But nothing, not his years of experience nor his carefully cultivated professional detachment, could prepare Elias Thorne for the full, heartbreaking, and brutal truth Thomas was so desperately, so fiercely, trying to conceal beneath that simple, tattered piece of fabric. Elias Thorne was a man who seemed to live in the subtle shades of gray and sepia. Much like the classic monochrome portraits, he still occasionally favored for his private work, a nostalgic nod to the masters of old. In his late 50s, with a lean frame, a thoughtful, lined face, and eyes that had appraised thousands of human expressions, searching for that fleeting flicker of authentic emotion, he was a craftsman of light and shadow, a patient observer of humanity's small, telling moments. His own life had certainly seen its share of deep shadows. The loss of his beloved wife, Clara, to a sudden illness a decade prior had left an indelible mark, a quiet, persistent ache that resonated in the profound solitude of his downtown apartment and the meticulously organized but seldom visited rooms of his actual photography studio. Clara had been the vibrant color in his life, and without her, the world often felt muted. He preferred the on-location school shoots these days, despite the logistical challenges. The youthful chaos, the sheer, unadulterated energy of the children, was a welcome, albeit temporary, distraction from the echoing quiet of his solitary existence. Yet, he always felt a familiar pang of something akin to loneliness when the last child departed, their joyful laughter echoing briefly in the suddenly vast space before silence, heavy and complete, reclaimed the gymnasium or cafeteria. He was, by nature and by profession, deeply observant, a connoisseur of micro-expressions, a skill honed by years of coaxing natural smiles from reluctant subjects, of knowing when to press gently and when to retreat. And Thomas, a small, wiry boy in Mrs. Albright's 2nd grade class, with his too large, faded red baseball cap pulled low over his brow, had been on his periphery for the entire week he'd been intermittently present at the school, setting up and testing equipment in various ancillary spaces. The cap, Elias had noted with a flicker of detached curiosity, never ever came off. Not in the hallways, not during a brief glimpse of him in the cafeteria line, not even when he was seemingly engrossed in a playground game. It was as if it were fused to his head. His primary point of contact at Northwood Elementary for the logistical nightmare that was picture day was usually the unflappable school secretary, Mrs. Gable, but today Mrs. Albright, Thomas's teacher, hovered nearby, her brow furrowed with a mixture of maternal concern and mild exasperation. She was a young, energetic woman, barely 5 years into her teaching career, her classroom adorned with bright, enthusiastic displays. She was eager and earnest, clearly dedicated, but perhaps Elias thought with the quiet wisdom of his years, a little overwhelmed by the sheer volume of diverse needs and unspoken stories that undoubtedly filled her second-grade classroom. He'd seen her try, gently but firmly, to get Thomas to remove the hat earlier in the week during one of his setup days. "Thomas, honey, no hats in class. Remember the school rules?" she'd said kindly, her voice carrying across the classroom. Thomas had just shaken his head, a small, almost violent movement, shrinking further into himself, his shoulders hunching as if anticipating a reprimand. Mrs. Albright had sighed then, a small sound of defeat, shot Elias an apologetic, "What can you do?" look, and moved on to another child, likely attributing Thomas's unwavering adherence to the cap to a new student quirk, a security blanket phase, or perhaps a stubborn streak. Children were, after all, often perplexing creatures of habit. The antagonist, the shadowy source of Thomas's profound fear and his desperate need to keep his head covered, was an unseen phantom, a chilling, undefined question mark hovering just beyond Elias's direct line of sight. However, a disturbing fragment of an image had imprinted itself on Elias's mind. When Thomas had been dropped off on Monday morning, Elias, while hauling in a heavy case of backdrops through a side entrance, had caught a fleeting glimpse of the exchange near the school's main doors. A tall, gaunt man with tired, deeply shadowed, angry eyes had been with Thomas. He hadn't spoken any audible words of farewell, hadn't offered a reassuring pat or a hug. He'd simply given Thomas a small, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably rough shove towards the school entrance, his movements jerky and impatient. The man's face was sallow, etched with lines of discontent, his clothes rumpled and ill-fitting. There was a faint, stale odor of cigarettes and something else, something vaguely chemical and unpleasant, that had seemed to cling to him even from a distance of several yards. It was a fleeting image, a micro-cameo of profound disquiet, a discordant note in the usual morning symphony of parental affection and encouragement. But it had lodged itself firmly in Elias's memory. The man's impatient, almost resentful posture, the way Thomas had flinched almost invisibly when the man's bony hand had briefly, heavily, rested on his small shoulder. It was a touch that seemed to convey not comfort, but a grim warning. The school gymnasium, a cavernous space that usually echoed with the rhythmic squeak of sneakers on polished wood and the enthusiastic thud of basketballs, was now a temporary, bewildering maze of backdrop stands draped in vibrant blues and mottled grays, towering lighting umbrellas resembling metallic sunflowers, and a labyrinth of snaking black cables taped to the floor. The air smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner from the runners Elias had put down, mingled with the subtle, sweet scent of children's hairspray and the almost palpable aura of nervous anticipation. Elias had his well-honed routine down to a precise science. A quick, friendly greeting to disarm a minor, almost subliminal adjustment to a stray hair or a rumpled collar, a silly joke or a funny face to elicit that precious, natural smile, then click, 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 a rapid burst of shots. Next, he moved with an efficiency born of decades. But Thomas, when his turn finally came, was different. He wasn't just shy or typically reluctant. He was, Elias recognized with a sudden, cold lurch in his chest, genuinely terrified. As his small figure moved slowly up the line, his approach to the brightly lit photographic station was like watching a condemned man walk his final mile. His small body grew increasingly rigid, his knuckles showing white where he gripped the brim of the cap as if it were a shield against an impending onslaught. Elias had seen hat resistance before: bad hair days, unwavering loyalty to favorite sports teams, even outright defiance. But this was something else entirely, something darker, more primal. This was a profound fear, a desperate, silent clinging to a flimsy, tattered piece of red cotton. The initial stake, the professional annoyance, was just a ruined picture, a frustrated teacher, a minor blip in a busy day. But as Elias looked closer, as he truly saw the child before him, a colder, deeper, and far more sinister stake began to emerge from the accumulating shadows of his intuition. When Thomas finally stood rooted before the bright blue backdrop, a small, isolated figure dwarfed by the professional equipment, Elias knelt, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, a technique he always used to appear less intimidating. His voice was gentle, carefully modulated. "Hey there, Thomas. That's a great cap. Looks like it's seen a lot of adventures. But for the picture, just for this one quick moment, we need to see that handsome face of yours. Just for a second, okay? Then it can go right back on." Thomas shook his head violently, a jerky, desperate movement, his eyes wide and darting towards Mrs. Albright, who stood watching a few feet away, then back to Elias, then towards the gymnasium exit like a small, trapped animal searching for an escape route. "No," he whispered, his voice so faint it was almost swallowed by the ambient hum of the lights. "Can't. I can't, Mrs. Albright." Her patience clearly thinning but her voice still attempting a kind register, approached. "Thomas, it's picture day. It's a special day. Everyone takes their hat off for their picture. It'll be quick, I promise. Then you can put it right back on." Her tone was meant to be encouraging but carried an undercurrent of firm expectation. Thomas began to tremble visibly, his lower lip quivering, his small hands twisting the brim of the cap. Elias saw it then, not just a fleeting glimpse this time, but a clear, undeniable view as Thomas inadvertently shifted his head. A very faint, yellowish-purple bruise, no bigger than a thumbprint, was starkly visible just above his temple, right where the worn edge of the cap's brim met his hairline. It was almost hidden by a wisp of his fine, sandy brown hair, but it was undeniably there. Elias's breath caught in his throat. A sudden, icy stillness enveloped him despite the gymnasium's warmth. He'd photographed enough children with the usual playground bumps, scraped knees, and clumsy toddler bruises to know what they looked like. This felt different. The placement, the color, the way Thomas so desperately tried to keep it concealed. It resonated with a deeper, more deliberate kind of hurt. His initial professional annoyance, his mild frustration, morphed instantly into a cold, sickening knot of dread in the pit of his stomach. He knew, with a chilling certainty that transcended logic and demanded attention, that this wasn't just about a hat. This was about what the hat was so desperately, so terrifyingly hiding. He made a split-second decision, his mind racing, his protective instincts, long dormant since Clara's passing, flaring to life. "You know what, Mrs. Albright?" Elias said, forcing a casual, reassuring smile onto his face, a feat of acting he hadn't realized he still possessed. "Some kids are just really, really attached to their hats. It's like a part of them. Let's try one with it on, just for him, a special exception, and then maybe we can try one without later if he feels up to it. No pressure at all, right, sport?" He winked at Thomas, though he doubted the boy even registered it. Mrs. Albright looked surprised. Then a wave of visible relief washed over her face. She clearly hadn't relished a protracted battle of wills. Elias took a few quick shots of Thomas, cap firmly in place, the boy's eyes still wide with apprehension, his body rigid with tension. He couldn't shake the image of that small, discolored patch of skin. He had to know more. He had to see. His decision to not force the issue was entirely strategic. He needed to gain a sliver of Thomas's trust, or at the very least, not terrify him further into absolute silence. The challenge was now starkly clear. How to see what was hidden without causing more harm, without breaking the fragile thread of whatever precarious composure Thomas still possessed. The rest of picture day passed in a muted blur for Elias. He went through the motions, his professional smile fixed, his directions to the other children almost on autopilot. His mind, however, was elsewhere, replaying the encounter with Thomas, the raw fear in the boy's eyes, the chilling glimpse of that bruise, the unnatural tension in that small body. He found himself unconsciously scanning the other students with a new, heightened vigilance, looking for any other signs, any other children who seemed overly fearful, excessively withdrawn, or bore unexplained marks. He packed up his extensive array of equipment slowly that afternoon, long after the last class had filed out, his thoughts churning like a turbulent sea. He couldn't just let it go. He couldn't unsee what he'd seen, unfeel what he'd felt. He had witnessed too many fleeting, unspoken things in his long career, heard too many hushed, worried stories from teachers over the years during quiet moments amidst the photographic chaos. He knew that sometimes the smallest, most insignificant-seeming details, the things easily dismissed as quirks or childhood eccentricities, were the very things that screamed the loudest if one only knew how to listen, how to truly see. He thought about Thomas's school file. Did it list any allergies that might cause skin discoloration, any medical conditions like hemophilia that might explain easy or unusual bruising? Highly unlikely, his gut told him. He needed a legitimate, professionally acceptable reason to look closer, to bring his concerns to someone who could act. The next day, Elias returned to Northwood Elementary on the carefully constructed pretext of needing to reshoot a few images where children had blinked at the crucial moment or the lighting had been slightly off, a common enough occurrence in the unpredictable world of school photography, and a perfect excuse for his continued presence. His real, singular motive was Thomas. He found Mrs. Albright in her classroom during her prep period, the room momentarily quiet, a rare lull in the school day. "Mrs. Albright," Elias began, arranging his features into an expression of mild professional concern, trying to sound casual. "I was just reviewing the proofs from yesterday, and I was wondering about Thomas. His picture with the hat on is... Okay, it'll pass, but the school administration and often the parents really do prefer one without the hat, if at all possible. Is he always so attached to it? I mean, even outside of picture day." Mrs. Albright sighed, a sound heavy with a teacher's daily weariness, as she tidied a stack of colorful workbooks. "He's new this year, Mr. Thorne. Started a few weeks after the semester began. And yes, that hat is practically a permanent fixture. His file is pretty sparse. Mentions he's living with his uncle, a Mr. Jedediah Riggs. Father deceased, mother, well, not in the picture, it seems. Not much else in there that's helpful. There's a brief note from his previous school that just says Thomas is a bit sensitive, prone to rather imaginative stories." Apparently, Elias's blood ran a little colder at that phrase. Imaginative stories. It was so often a convenient, dismissive label for truths too uncomfortable or complicated for adults to address. Uncle, he thought, the image of the gaunt, angry-eyed man from the drop-off flashing vividly in his mind. This was a potential setback, a significant hurdle. If the teacher already had a preconceived notion of Thomas being overly dramatic or a fabricator, his own less-than-concrete concerns might be easily dismissed, brushed aside as another photographer's fleeting observation. He would need to be much more careful, much more strategic. Elias made a point of bumping into Thomas in the hallway later that day, during a class transition. He knelt, his movements slow and unthreatening. "Hey, Thomas. Remember me?" The camera guy, Thomas, startled, nodded, his eyes still wary, his hand instinctively flying up to the brim of his cap, pressing it down as if to ensure its continued presence. "I was just thinking," Elias said softly, his voice pitched low and conspiratorial. "That cap is so cool. It's a great color. Is it your absolute favorite?" Thomas gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the linoleum floor. Does it keep your head safe?" Elias asked, the words out before he could fully censor them. A shot in the dark, a direct probe launched from his gut. Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes widening almost comically for a split second. A flash of raw surprise, and then, just as quickly, they filled with a profound, heartbreaking sadness, an ocean of unspoken sorrow. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. He just looked down at his worn sneakers, his small shoulders hunching further. That reaction, that lightning-fast shift from surprise to deep, engulfing sorrow, was more telling, more damning, than any verbal confession could ever be. It was another crucial piece of the terrible puzzle, a visceral confirmation of his growing dread. The hat wasn't just a comfort item, a beloved possession. It was perceived, in Thomas's terrified child logic, as a form of protection. Elias felt a deep, resonant pang of responsibility, a weight settling upon his own shoulders. He was just a photographer, an outsider, a temporary fixture in the school's ecosystem, but he had seen something, felt something, that he simply couldn't ignore, couldn't walk away from. His informal, almost accidental investigation, if it could even be dignified with such a term, became more focused, more deliberate in the following days. He started arriving a little earlier each day. He was scheduled to be at the school for makeup shots or specific class projects he'd conveniently remembered. He positioned himself discreetly near the main entrance or by a window overlooking the drop-off zone. His long-lens camera sometimes in hand as a plausible excuse for his loitering, ostensibly testing light levels or capturing candid school life shots for a potential yearbook supplement. Twice more, during these clandestine observations, he saw Mr. Jedediah Riggs with Thomas. Each time, the man's demeanor was consistently harsh, his movements abrupt, his face a mask of grim impatience. He never smiled. He never touched Thomas with any discernible affection, only with a rough grip on the arm to hurry him along or a sharp, directive push to the shoulder that seemed unnecessarily forceful, borderline violent. During one such observation, a particularly chilling moment etched itself into Elias's memory. Riggs snatched Thomas's small, brown paper lunch bag from him just as they reached the school steps, rummaged through it with a sneer of disgust, then practically threw it back at the boy, muttering something too low for Elias to hear, but Thomas visibly cringed, his head ducking as if anticipating a blow. This was the second clear micro-cameo of the antagonist, a stark reinforcement of Elias's deepest fears. Riggs's very presence was oppressive, casting a palpable pall over the child, even from a distance. Elias felt a cold fury begin to smolder beneath his professional composure. Elias found himself wrestling with a profound moral dilemma, a constant internal debate that gnawed at his peace of mind. He had no concrete, irrefutable proof, just a series of deeply unsettling observations, a collection of disturbing emotional responses from Thomas, and a powerful, unwavering gut feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. If he went to the principal, Mr. Davies, with his suspicions based on such ephemeral evidence and was proven wrong, he could severely damage his professional reputation, a reputation built carefully over 30 years. He could even risk losing his lucrative contracts with the school district, his primary source of income. Northwood's principal, Mr. Davies, was known to be a stern, by-the-book administrator, a man who valued hard data and clear protocols, not generally known for indulging the gut feelings of itinerant photographers. Elias felt a significant dip in his own morale, a wave of self-doubt washing over him. Was he overreacting? Was he seeing shadows where there were none? Was he, perhaps, projecting his own past sorrows, his own lingering loneliness, onto this small, quiet child? He spent a long, sleepless night in his quiet apartment, the city lights casting long, dancing shadows across his living room floor. His wife Clara's portrait, her smile warm and encouraging, looking down at him from the mantelpiece. She had been a social worker before they married, fiercely dedicated, passionately committed to protecting the vulnerable, the voiceless. He could almost hear her voice, gentle but firm. What would Clara have done? The answer, when it came, was clear, unequivocal, and shaming in its simplicity. She would have found a way. She would not have rested. The next opportunity, the crucial opening he had been hoping for, came unexpectedly, as such things often do. He was in the school office later that week, discussing the final photo package proofs and delivery schedules with Mrs. Gable, the secretary, when he overheard Mrs. Albright, Thomas's teacher, speaking in hushed, frustrated tones to the school nurse, Ms. Evans. Ms. Evans was a kind, competent, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with reassuring eyes and an air of calm capability. Elias had chatted with her briefly a few times over the years during his school visits. And he just won't take that blasted hat off, not even for a second, even when he complained vociferously of his head itching terribly yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Albright was saying, her voice a mixture of exasperation and genuine concern. He was scratching like mad. I'm really worried it might be, critters' head lice. The word hung in the air. Elias's mind seized on it with an almost electric jolt. This was it. This was his opening. This was a legitimate, undeniable, non-negotiable reason for that hat to come off, for someone in authority, someone with medical training, to look closely, very closely at Thomas's head. He waited, his heart pounding, until Mrs. Albright had finished her consultation and hurried back to her classroom. Then he approached Nurse Evans's open doorway. "Excuse me, Miss Evans," he said, his voice carefully neutral despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Mrs. Albright. About Thomas in her class? The little boy with the red baseball cap." Nurse Evans nodded, her expression one of professional weariness. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. Another one on the list to check. It's always that time of year, it seems. I photographed him for picture day earlier this week," Elias continued, choosing his words with extreme care, his mind racing to frame his concern in the most credible, least alarmist way. "And I noticed, well, when he moved just so, I thought I saw a rather nasty-looking bruise near his temple, right under the cap's edge. And his hair, in that particular spot, looked a bit matted, perhaps? It might be absolutely nothing, of course. Children are always bumping themselves. But with him complaining of itching now, and if there are concerns about lice, perhaps that area warrants a closer look than usual? Just to be absolutely safe, Nurse Evans looked at him then, truly looked at him, her gaze sharpening, her head tilting slightly in assessment. "Matted, you say? And a bruise?" Elias nodded, meeting her gaze steadily. "It was just a glimpse, as I said, but it concerned me. It didn't look like a typical playground bump." Miss Evans pursed her lips, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for mentioning it, Mr. Thorne. That's helpful information. I'll need to check him today anyway as part of the classroom screening. I'll be thorough, I assure you." This was a significant step forward, a crucial escalation. He had managed to voice his concern, to plant the seed, through a legitimate, established channel. The tension was palpable for Elias as he left the office. He had set something potentially life-altering in motion. Now all he could do was wait. Later that day, Elias found a reason to linger, meticulously organizing his proof sets and order forms in the small, borrowed office space the school provided him, a room conveniently located not far from Nurse Evans's clinic. He made sure his work took him past her open doorway several times, his casual glances betraying none of the turmoil within. Finally, he saw Miss Evans at her desk. She was alone, looking at a student file, her brow deeply furrowed, her shoulders slumped. She glanced up, her eyes shadowed with something he couldn't quite decipher, and saw him hesitating in the hallway. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quieter than usual, beckoning him in with a small gesture. She closed the door quietly but firmly behind him, a gesture that immediately signaled the gravity of the situation. "I checked Thomas," she began, her voice low and serious, stripped of its usual brisk efficiency. "There were no lice, thankfully, but you were right to be concerned." Very, very right. Her eyes, usually so calm and competent, met his, and in their depths, he saw a chilling reflection of his own dread. His own sickening fears now given terrifying substance. "Under that cap, Elias, it's bad. It's very bad." The use of his first name was another stark indicator. "His hair is terribly matted on one entire side, just above his ear, caked with something. I think it's dried blood, old and new. And there are several older, faded bruises, yellowish and green, across his scalp, hidden by his hair, and one fresh, very angry-looking, raised welt just above his left ear, almost hidden by the matted section. It looks like he's been struck, hard, and repeatedly, with something specific." Elias felt a cold wave wash over him, stealing his breath, making the small, brightly lit clinic suddenly feel suffocating. The full horror, the devastating reality he had suspected but had desperately, foolishly hoped was somehow an overactive imagination, crashed down upon him with sickening, undeniable force. This wasn't just neglect, or a single accidental injury magnified by his concern. This was sustained, calculated, brutal abuse, The game had irrevocably changed. The stakes were no longer about a school picture or a teacher's fleeting concern. They were about a child's life, his ongoing safety, his very future. He told me, Nurse Evans continued, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly, her professional composure strained to its limits. When I was gently, so gently, cleaning the area, he whispered, his little voice shaking, that his uncle gets real mad when he makes noise or don't listen good. He said the hat keeps the mad from getting in his head too much. The child's desperate, heartbreakingly innocent logic, his attempt to create a magical shield against unimaginable adult fury, sent a shiver of pure ice down Elias's spine. The hat wasn't just hiding injuries. It was a talisman, a child's desperate, futile attempt to ward off further blows, to somehow control the uncontrollable. I've already paged Mr. Davies, Nurse Evans said, her jaw tight with a barely suppressed, righteous anger. He's on his way down, and I'm making the call to Child Protective Services right now. This is far beyond school policy. This is a crime. We have to move quickly. The countdown had officially begun. They had to ensure Thomas was safe, secured, before he was due to be picked up from school by his uncle in just a few short hours. The pressure in the small room was immense, almost unbearable. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, a potent cocktail of profound fear for Thomas and a grim, steely determination to see this through to its end, whatever that might be. He, Nurse Evans, and soon Mr. Davies, the school principal, would need to formulate a plan, a careful, precise, tactical intervention to protect Thomas and confront the monster who was his uncle, the man who was supposed to be his protector. The school day was ticking away with terrifying speed. Elias knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he would stay. He had to. He looked at Nurse Evans, a newfound, profound respect for her quiet strength, her unwavering resolve, dawning within him. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice raspy. "How can I help?" "Be a witness, Elias," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You saw the initial signs. You persisted. Your observations, your instincts, they are important. Stay. We might need you." The ramp up to the inevitable confrontation, the intervention, was terrifying to contemplate, but Elias felt a strange, almost preternatural sense of clarity. He had followed his instincts, however vague and unsettling they had initially been, and now the vast, often impersonal machinery of protection was, however slowly, grinding into motion. The final hours of the school day felt suspended in an eerie, surreal bubble of time. Mr. Davies, the principal, looking grim-faced and visibly shaken after Nurse Evans's detailed, hushed report in his office, had immediately agreed that CPS and the police needed to be involved without delay. Two plainclothes officers, a Detective Miller, whose calm demeanor and sharp eyes inspired a degree of confidence, and a younger Officer Chun, arrived discreetly, their unmarked car parking in a staff spot away from the main entrance. They were accompanied by a CPS caseworker, Ms. Anya Sharma, a woman whose gentle voice and kind eyes seemed to belie the tough, often heartbreaking nature of her job. Thomas, blessedly unaware of the storm brewing around him, was kept in the nurse's office, ostensibly resting on a cot because he felt a bit unwell after lunch, a necessary and compassionate deception to keep him safe, secure, and away from his classroom, where his uncle might expect to find him at the end-of-day dismissal. Elias, at Detective Miller's quiet request, sat with them in Ms. Evans's small, cluttered office, recounting his initial observations from picture day, the profound fear in Thomas's eyes, the fleeting glimpse of that first damning bruise, the unsettling, aggressive demeanor of Mr. Riggs during the drop-offs. His photographer's eye for detail, for the nuances of expression and body language, proved unexpectedly invaluable, painting a clear, compelling picture of the mounting unease and the reasons for his persistent concern. Miss Sharma, meanwhile, spoke with Thomas in soft, reassuring tones, her voice a gentle murmur, while Detective Miller listened intently from a slight distance, his expression largely unreadable but his gaze sharp and focused. Thomas, in the quiet, safe presence of these new, kind adult faces, and with Nurse Evans steadfastly by his side offering quiet encouragement, began to open up, his words hesitant and small at first, then gradually gaining a fragile momentum. He described in fragmented childlike terms how his uncle would get angry over small things, how he would sometimes be locked in his room for hours, and yes, how his uncle would hit him on the head, especially when the hat wasn't on right, or when he cried. The carefully orchestrated plan was for Ms. Sharma and Detective Miller to be present, waiting discreetly in the main office area, when Jedediah Riggs arrived to pick up Thomas. Officer Chun would be positioned unobtrusively nearby. Elias, at Detective Miller's specific request, agreed to wait in an adjacent, rarely used records office, a room with a small, one-way glass window overlooking the main office counter. He could potentially identify Riggs if there was any ambiguity, but primarily his role was to be out of the direct line of any potential confrontation, a civilian witness kept safe. The tension in that small, dusty records office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elias paced the limited space, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He heard the familiar cacophony of the dismissal bell ring throughout the school, followed by the distant, receding sounds of children's excited chatter, the rumble and hiss of school buses pulling away from the curb. Then, an unnerving silence descended upon the administrative wing. A new, more ominous quiet. Minutes stretched into an unbearable eternity. Finally, shattering the stillness, he heard a male voice, harsh, impatient, and demanding, from the main office area. "I'm here for Thomas Riggs. He better not have caused any trouble today, Jedediah." Elias's breath hitched in his throat. His hand instinctively went to the window, though he knew he shouldn't draw attention to himself. He heard Miss Sharma's calm, professional voice responding, then Detective Miller's, firm, measured, and utterly authoritative, introducing himself and Miss Sharma. There were no shouts, no sounds of a struggle, just a low, tense murmur of voices, then the distinct, sharp, metallic click of handcuffs. It was over. The monster had been caught. Elias felt his knees go weak with a relief so profound it was almost painful. He sank into a rickety wooden chair in the records office, the adrenaline that had coursed through him for hours suddenly ebbing, leaving him feeling hollow, shaky, and utterly exhausted. Nurse Evans, her face pale but etched with an undeniable relief, came in a few moments later. "They have him, Elias," she said softly, her voice still tinged with the day's strain. "Riggs is in custody. Thomas is safe. Miss Sharma is with him now in my office." He didn't have to see his uncle get arrested. They managed it very smoothly. She put a comforting, steadying hand on Elias's shoulder. "You did good, Elias. You really did. You listened to that little voice, that instinct, and you spoke up when it mattered most. You probably saved that boy from so much more." He could only nod, a lump in his throat too large for words, his carefully constructed professional composure finally crumbling. The emotional cost of the past few days, the constant weight of suspicion and fear, had been immense, a heavy burden carried in silence. But Thomas was safe. That was the only thing that truly mattered. A profound, almost sacred silence settled in Nurse Evans's small, now empty office where Elias had retreated, broken only by the distant, reassuring hum of the school's heating system and the sound of Elias's own ragged, uneven breathing. He finally let out a long, shuddering sigh, a visible release of tension that had been coiled tightly within him for days, perhaps even weeks. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in his eyes, blurring the image of the cheerful, cartoonish health posters tacked to the corkboard on the wall. They weren't tears of sadness, not entirely, but of an overwhelming, almost painful relief, a purging of accumulated fear and anxiety. He felt Nurse Evans give his shoulder another gentle, understanding squeeze before she quietly excused herself to go check on Thomas and Miss Sharma, leaving him to his private catharsis. Detective Miller had briefly stuck his head into the records office before leaving with Riggs securely in tow. "Your initial observation on picture day was critical, Mr. Thorne," he'd said, his voice professional but with an undertone of respect. "It gave us the leverage, the documented concern, to push for an immediate welfare check when Nurse Evans presented her findings today. The school, I understand, is already reviewing its protocols for head injuries, unexplained marks, and persistent noncompliance with things like the dress code, looking at how to flag these potential indicators earlier for counselor or nurse intervention. What you started by speaking up has already made them rethink their processes here. Elias absorbed this information. The words a small measure of systemic comfort in the face of such intimate, personal trauma inflicted upon a child. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt significant. A week later, a time during which Elias found himself replaying the events with a strange mixture of lingering horror and quiet pride. Ms. Sharma, the CPS caseworker, called him. Thomas, she reported, was in a safe, specialized temporary foster home and was beginning to receive the intensive counseling he so desperately needed. He was, she said, very quiet, still subdued, but he had asked about the cameraman with the kind eyes, a designation that brought a fresh wave of emotion to Elias. Ms. Sharma explained that Thomas was drawing a lot, a common way for traumatized children to express what they couldn't yet articulate. He had made a picture, she said, that he specifically wanted Elias to have. She offered to bring it by his downtown studio if he was amenable. When she arrived a few days later, Thomas was with her, holding her hand tightly, his small figure almost hidden behind hers as they entered the unfamiliar space of Elias's studio. He was still visibly subdued, his movements tentative, but the hunted, terrified look in his eyes had noticeably softened, replaced by a fragile, healing watchfulness. He wasn't wearing the faded red baseball cap. Instead, his fine, sandy hair, now clean and neatly brushed, showed the faint, fading marks on his scalp like ghostly reminders, but also, importantly, the undeniable promise of healthy new growth. He silently, shyly, handed Elias a carefully folded piece of construction paper. Elias unfolded it with gentle fingers. It was a crayon drawing, rendered in surprisingly bold colors, of a large old-fashioned camera on a tripod, and next to it, a stick figure with a disproportionately large shock of gray hair, unmistakably smiling. Below it, Thomas, clearly with Ms. Sharma's patient help, had printed his name in shaky, uneven capitals, Thomas. He then looked up at Elias, his gaze direct for the first time, and offered a tiny, hesitant, yet incredibly brave smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. In that silent, profound exchange, that small, courageous smile and the simple, heartfelt drawing, Elias understood with absolute clarity. He hadn't just helped stop the immediate darkness for one small, suffering boy. He had helped preserve a future, a precious chance for that smile to grow wider, brighter, more confident with each passing day. The first, fragile, miraculous seeds of healing and trust were, at that very moment, being sown in the fertile ground of safety and kindness. Elias knew, with the wisdom of his years and the depth of his empathy, that Thomas's journey to recovery would be long and undoubtedly arduous. The invisible scars of abuse, the deep wounds to his spirit and his sense of self, ran far deeper than the fading bruises on his scalp, and healing would be a slow, painstaking, day-by-day process. Recovery wouldn't be instant. There were no magical fixes for such profound trauma, but the essential foundation for safety, for a life free from constant terror and pain, had finally, blessedly, been laid. The path ahead for Thomas was unquestionably challenging, but for the first time in what was likely a very long and desolate time for the little boy, the possibility of sunlight, of genuine kindness, of simple childhood joy, felt real and truly attainable. Elias returned to his photography, to the familiar rhythms of his work, but something fundamental within him had shifted, had been reawakened. The faces he captured through his lens now seemed to hold even more depth, more untold stories. His quiet, solitary apartment felt a little less empty, a little warmer, subtly brightened by the memory of Thomas's small, courageous smile and the crayon drawing of the camera, now carefully, reverently pinned above his main workbench where he could see it every day. He found a renewed, more profound sense of purpose in his work, a deeper appreciation for the fleeting, precious moments of childhood, and a more vigilant, compassionate eye for the unspoken stories, the silent cries for help that might lie hidden beneath the surface of a smile or averted gaze. The Northwood School District did indeed implement new, more robust training programs for all staff, and Elias, to his own surprise, even volunteered to help create some of the visual aids, using his photographic skills to illustrate subtle signs of distress and neglect in children for teacher training modules. Several months later, when the vibrant colors of autumn had given way to the stark quiet of early winter, Miss Sharma contacted Elias again. Thomas, she reported with genuine warmth in her voice, was doing remarkably well in his therapeutic foster care placement. He was slowly, cautiously, starting to engage with other children, even to laugh sometimes, a sound Miss Sharma described as pure music. "He still asks about you, Elias," Miss Sharma said. "He calls you his picture friend. His foster parents are wonderful, dedicated people, but he benefits so much from consistent, positive male role models, especially those who were part of his rescue, who represent safety and kindness to him. We're always looking for community mentors for children like Thomas, people willing to offer a few hours a month, a stable presence. Would you ever consider it, Elias? No pressure, of course, but I thought of you immediately." Elias looked at the drawing Thomas had given him, the smiling gray-haired stick figure beside the camera. He thought of his quiet life, the often unfilled spaces that Clara's absence had left. A warmth, unexpected and profound, spread through his chest. "Yes," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, imbued with a conviction he hadn't realized he possessed. "Yes, Ms. Sharma, I would be honored." Very much so. It was the hopeful, luminous, and entirely unexpected beginning of a new chapter in his own life. A connection forged in the desperate, shared need for protection, now blossoming into a quiet promise of steady, kind companionship, a mutual gift. That evening, Elias sat in his worn leather armchair, the city lights twinkling like distant, friendly stars outside his apartment window. He held Thomas's crayon drawing in his hands, the simple lines and bright, optimistic colors a small, powerful beacon against the encroaching darkness. A profound sense of earned peace, a quiet, resonant satisfaction, settled over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in many years. The world, for the first time in a long while, felt a little less gray, subtly imbued with the tangible, hopeful beginning of safety and recovery for a little boy who had once hidden all his pain, all his fear, beneath a faded, tattered red baseball cap. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.
When a school counselor notices a 7-year-old boy who never removes his wool beanie, even during PE class in hot summer weather, every protective instinct tells her something is terribly wrong. Day after day, the child suffers through obvious overheating and discomfort rather than take off that hat, becoming physically ill from heat exhaustion but still refusing to expose his head. What she discovered when she made a surprise visit to his home would reveal a horror that explained why keeping his head covered had become a matter of life and death survival. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe in protecting innocent children who cannot speak for themselves, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. At first, Rachel Thompson thought the child had a medical condition, until she uncovered the devastating truth that would change everything. Rachel Thompson had been a certified school counselor and licensed mental health therapist for 18 years, and in that time, she developed what her colleagues called an extraordinary ability to recognize when children were hiding traumatic secrets behind carefully constructed protective behaviors. Her office at Riverside Elementary, designed according to trauma-informed therapeutic principles, had become a sanctuary for students dealing with everything from separation anxiety to severe family trauma. The space reflected her dual training in education and clinical psychology, soft lighting chosen for its therapeutic benefits, flexible seating arrangements that accommodated different comfort levels, and walls decorated with student artwork that conveyed messages of resilience and hope. At 45, Rachel brought comprehensive experience from her previous decade as a child trauma specialist at the Regional Children's Hospital, where she'd specialized in working with victims of severe abuse and neglect. Her transition to school-based counseling had been motivated by her commitment to early identification, recognizing and addressing trauma within children's educational environments, rather than waiting for psychological symptoms to reach clinical severity requiring intensive hospital-based treatment. Rachel's therapeutic approach was rooted in attachment theory and somatic trauma recovery, understanding that children's protective behaviors often represented sophisticated survival strategies that made perfect sense within their traumatic circumstances, even when those behaviors appeared puzzling or disruptive to educational personnel. Her office featured specialized therapeutic tools, including trauma-focused art supplies, mindfulness resources designed for children, and sensory regulation equipment that helped students manage overwhelming emotions and physical responses. The school served a diverse suburban community in Southern California, where families ranged from entertainment industry professionals and technology workers to immigrant families and service industry employees dealing with economic instability and language barriers that could complicate access to mental health services. Rachel had developed cultural competency in recognizing how different forms of family stress, immigration concerns, economic pressure, cultural conflicts, domestic violence could manifest in children's academic performance and emotional regulation. Her therapeutic caseload included students dealing with developmental challenges like ADHD and autism spectrum disorders, as well as more complex situations involving severe abuse, trafficking, and various forms of systematic trauma. Rachel's clinical training had taught her to observe subtle behavioral indicators and physiological responses that might suggest children were experiencing ongoing harm or living in environments that threatened their basic safety. On this particular Thursday morning in early June, Rachel was conducting her routine monitoring of morning arrival patterns when she noticed 7-year-old Diego Morales approaching the building with the same hyper-vigilant body language she'd learned to associate with children living in chronic fear. Despite the forecasted temperature of 92 degrees and the school's air conditioning system that often struggled during summer heat, Diego was wearing a thick wool beanie pulled down almost to his eyebrows, a practice he'd maintained consistently for the past 6 weeks. This was the 38th consecutive school day Rachel had observed Diego wearing the same heavy winter hat, regardless of weather conditions, indoor temperatures, or physical activities that would cause obvious overheating. Even more concerning was his extreme physiological distress when wearing the hat during warm weather. She'd witnessed him becoming nauseous, dizzy, and requiring frequent water breaks. Yet he consistently refused to remove the hat, even when explicitly encouraged by teachers and medical personnel. Diego Morales had been on Rachel's therapeutic priority list since late April, when his first-grade teacher had requested an urgent consultation about dramatic changes in his behavior and academic engagement that seemed to coincide with his sudden insistence on wearing head covering at all times. Diego had previously been described as a bright, energetic student who enjoyed physical activities and social interaction with classmates. However, since returning from spring break, he had become increasingly withdrawn, anxious, and resistant to any activities that might require or encourage hat removal. "He used to love our PE activities and playground time," Mrs. Garcia had explained during their initial consultation. "He was always one of the first kids ready for outdoor activities and games. Now he asks to sit out of anything active, saying he can't take his hat off because of family rules, and he becomes extremely agitated if anyone suggests he might be more comfortable without it." Tio. Rachel had documented these behavioral changes, understanding that sudden, extreme modifications in children's participation patterns and social engagement often indicated exposure to trauma or significant changes in their home environments that required therapeutic assessment and potential protective intervention. Diego came from what appeared to be a hard-working immigrant family. His father, Carlos Morales, worked construction jobs throughout the region, while his mother, Maria Morales, cleaned offices and provided childcare for other families in their apartment complex. On paper, the family seemed to be managing typical immigrant challenges, language barriers, economic instability, and cultural adaptation, without obvious red flags that would prompt immediate concern from school authorities. However, Rachel's therapeutic training had taught her that trafficking, exploitation, and severe abuse could occur within any family structure, and that immigrant families might face additional barriers to seeking help or reporting abuse due to fear of deportation, language difficulties, or unfamiliarity with available protective services. Her clinical experience had shown her that children from vulnerable populations were sometimes subjected to forms of systematic abuse that were carefully concealed to avoid detection by authorities. During her lunch break, Rachel decided to review Diego's academic and medical records more systematically, looking for patterns that might explain his extreme attachment to his winter hat and his obvious physical distress when required to wear it during warm weather. What she found was both limited and deeply concerning, suggesting possible efforts to minimize documentation of changes in his health and behavior. Diego's academic performance had declined dramatically since April, dropping from grade-appropriate progress to concerning deficits in attention and task completion. His classroom participation had decreased significantly, and multiple teachers had noted that he seemed exhausted and unfocused during instruction, as if he weren't getting adequate rest or was preoccupied with overwhelming concerns unrelated to academic activities. More significantly, Rachel noticed that Diego had begun making frequent requests to visit the nurse's office with complaints of severe headaches, nausea, and dizziness that seemed to correlate directly with warm weather and indoor heating. The pattern suggested that Diego's physical symptoms were related to wearing inappropriate clothing for temperature conditions, but his absolute refusal to remove his hat indicated that he feared consequences more severe than physical discomfort. Rachel also reviewed comments from Diego's specialist teachers, art, music, and physical education, looking for additional perspectives on his hat-wearing behavior and general presentation. What emerged was a picture of a child experiencing extreme anxiety and physical distress related to maintaining head coverage under inappropriate circumstances. Diego's art teacher, Miss Dias Rodriguez, noted that Diego had stopped participating in any activities that required movement or bending, claiming that he couldn't risk his hat falling off during creative work. His music teacher, Mr. Kim, reported that Diego no longer wanted to participate in dancing or instrument playing, expressing anxiety that active participation might cause his hat to shift or become displaced. Most concerning, Diego's PE teacher, Coach Williams, had documented several instances where Diego had become physically ill during outdoor activities, but still refused to remove his hat for cooling or medical assessment. Diego consistently stated that he had promises to keep about his hat, and that removing it would cause big trouble for my family. The cumulative evidence suggested that Diego was concealing something beneath his hat that he had been specifically instructed to hide from adult observation, and that the consequences for discovery had been described to him in terms that made physical suffering seem preferable to exposure. Rachel's therapeutic training told her that children who endured obvious physical discomfort to maintain concealment were usually hiding evidence of severe abuse or were living under threats that made exposure feel life-threatening. The reference to family consequences suggested systematic coaching and intimidation designed to prevent detection of ongoing abuse. That afternoon, Rachel decided to create an opportunity for therapeutic assessment with Diego, arranging for him to visit her office during music class for what she described to his teacher as routine counseling support for students showing signs of academic stress and adjustment difficulties. This timing would provide privacy for therapeutic work while avoiding disruption to core academic instruction. At 2:15 p.m., a quiet knock announced Diego's arrival. Rachel opened her door to find a small boy standing in the hallway with obvious signs of heat exhaustion, flushed face, rapid breathing, and perspiration. yet wearing a thick wool beanie that completely covered his hair and ears despite the building's warm temperature. "Hi, Diego," Rachel greeted warmly, noting his immediate tension and the way his hand instinctively moved to secure his hat when he realized he was in a private space with an adult who might ask questions about his appearance or comfort level. "Thanks for coming by. I like to check in with all my students to see how they're doing and if there's anything I can help with." Diego entered her office with careful movements, his hand remaining positioned on his hat as if ready to secure it against any attempt at removal. "How are things going for you at school lately?" Rachel asked, beginning with an open-ended therapeutic question while observing Diego's nonverbal responses and general presentation. "Fine," Diego replied quietly, though his obvious physical distress contradicted his verbal response. "Everything's okay." Rachel recognized the automatic response pattern common among children who had been coached to deflect questions about their well-being, particularly children from families where cultural norms or legal concerns might discourage disclosure to authority figures. "I'm glad to hear that some things feel okay," Rachel said gently, using therapeutic language that validated his response while creating space for more complex disclosure. "Sometimes when kids say everything's fine, it means that some things are good and some things might be harder or more complicated. Are there any parts of school that feel challenging right now?" Diego considered her question carefully, his hesitation suggesting internal conflict between his desire to communicate and his obvious fear about revealing sensitive information. "Sometimes I get headaches, and sometimes I worry about my hat." The admission about both physical pain and hat-related anxiety provided therapeutic entry points for exploring his circumstances while respecting his need for control over the pace of disclosure. "That sounds uncomfortable and stressful," Rachel replied with clinical empathy, noting how Diego's breathing seemed labored and his face showed signs of overheating. "Can you tell me more about what kinds of things make you worry about your hat?" Diego's response revealed the depth of his fear and the specific nature of his protective behavior. "I have to keep it on all the time. If someone sees me without it, they might see things they're not supposed to see, and that would cause big problems for my family." The reference to family consequences for hat removal confirmed Rachel's therapeutic assessment that Diego was concealing evidence of abuse while being psychologically manipulated about the dangers of discovery. This type of systematic coaching was characteristic of households where severe abuse was occurring, but where maintaining concealment was essential for avoiding intervention. "Diego, can you help me understand what kinds of things people aren't supposed to see?" Rachel asked gently, using therapeutic techniques designed to encourage disclosure while avoiding assumptions about his specific circumstances. "Things on my head. My dad says if anyone at school sees what's under my hat, it could get our family in trouble with the government, and people might try to split us up." The explicit reference to government intervention and family separation indicated that Diego was being systematically coached about the consequences of discovery, using his natural fear of family dissolution to ensure continued concealment of abuse evidence. "Diego, I want you to know that children should never be hurt in ways that leave marks they have to hide," Rachel said firmly but gently, using therapeutic language designed to provide education while beginning to challenge the abusive narratives he had internalized. When adults hurt children, especially in ways that cause visible injuries, that's the adult's problem and responsibility, not the child's fault. "It's—" Diego looked at Rachel with obvious surprise and confusion, as if this perspective contradicted everything he had been taught about family dynamics and personal responsibility for adult behavior. "But what if it's because I did something wrong? Dad says the marks are reminders to help me remember to follow rules better." The rationalization revealed extensive psychological manipulation designed to convince Diego that visible evidence of abuse was justified discipline rather than criminal assault, a distortion commonly used to maintain victim compliance and silence. Children learn best when they feel safe and loved, Rachel explained, using therapeutic principles designed to challenge abusive conditioning. Physical marks that need to be hidden don't help children learn. They just make children scared and confused about what love and safety should feel like. Rather than continuing to request hat removal in her office, where Diego's fear and conditioning made disclosure unlikely, Rachel made a therapeutic decision that would prove essential for his safety. She understood that Diego's extensive coaching and intimidation required direct environmental assessment to understand his true circumstances and gather evidence necessary for protective intervention. That evening, Rachel made a decision informed by her clinical training and legal obligations as a mandated reporter. Instead of continuing to attempt disclosure through traditional school-based therapeutic approaches, she decided to conduct a home visit under the pretext of delivering educational materials and discussing Diego's academic progress with his family. When Rachel arrived at the Morales family's apartment complex that evening, she immediately observed environmental factors that elevated her clinical concerns about Diego's safety and the family's circumstances. The building showed signs of overcrowding and minimal maintenance, with evidence of multiple families living in units designed for smaller populations and limited community oversight or resources. When Rachel knocked on the apartment door, she was greeted by Carlos Morales, a man who appeared to be in his 40s but showed signs of chronic stress, and what her clinical experience suggested might be untreated anger management issues and possible substance abuse. His immediate defensiveness about her presence and suspicious responses to routine inquiries about Diego's academic progress indicated someone who was actively concealing problematic family dynamics. "What do you need to know about Diego that can't be handled at school?" Carlos asked aggressively, his tone carrying obvious intimidation designed to discourage professional inquiry into private family matters. "I like to touch base with families when students are showing signs of academic stress," Rachel replied diplomatically, using her clinical training to maintain professional boundaries while observing family interactions and household dynamics that might provide insight into Diego's circumstances. When Diego appeared during the conversation, Rachel's worst clinical fears were confirmed in the most shocking way possible. A gust of wind from an open window had displaced Diego's beanie, revealing evidence of systematic abuse that exceeded even her experienced expectations for family violence cases. Diego's head showed clear evidence of systematic branding and burning that had created deliberate patterns and symbols across his scalp. The burns appeared to be intentionally designed wounds created with heated metal objects, forming what looked like ownership marks or identification symbols commonly associated with human trafficking operations. "Oh my God," Rachel whispered involuntarily, her clinical composure overwhelmed by the realization that Diego wasn't just experiencing family abuse, but was likely a victim of organized trafficking that was using systematic torture to mark and control him. The systematic branding patterns on Diego's scalp represented a level of organized abuse that went far beyond typical domestic violence, indicating involvement in criminal networks that used physical marking to claim ownership of trafficking victims and ensure compliance through terror. Rachel immediately reached for her cell phone to contact emergency services, understanding that Diego's injuries indicated participation in organized criminal activity that required immediate law enforcement intervention and specialized victim services. The 911 call Rachel made that evening triggered coordinated response from federal law enforcement, immigration services, and specialized human trafficking units. When authorities arrived at the apartment complex, they discovered evidence of an organized trafficking operation that had been using systematic torture and intimidation to control multiple child victims. Diego was immediately transported to a specialized medical facility where trauma surgeons and burn specialists worked to assess and treat the extensive branding injuries he had endured. The systematic nature of his wounds required specialized care from medical professionals trained in treating torture victims and trafficking survivors. Carlos Morales and several other adults in the building were arrested that evening on federal charges including human trafficking, child torture, and organized criminal activity. Investigation revealed an extensive network that had been systematically abusing multiple children while using branding and psychological intimidation to maintain control and prevent disclosure. Diego was placed in protective custody with specialized foster parents trained in caring for trafficking survivors, Elena and Roberto Santos, who had extensive experience helping children recover from organized abuse and systematic torture. Their home had been designed to provide therapeutic environments for children recovering from the most severe forms of trauma, featuring specialized medical support and trauma-informed therapeutic resources. "We're so happy to meet you, Diego," Elena said gently when Diego arrived at their home, his head still bandaged from the medical procedures required to treat his branding injuries. "We know you've been hurt very badly, but you're completely safe now. Our job is to help you heal and feel comfortable without having to hide anything about yourself." Diego, now wearing soft medical gauze instead of his concealing beanie, looked around the unfamiliar environment with cautious hope mixed with obvious trauma responses from months of systematic abuse and torture. "Do I have to wear something on my head all the time?" Diego asked quietly, this question revealing how central concealment had become to his understanding of safety and survival within the trafficking operation. "You can choose what feels comfortable for your head while it's healing," Roberto replied with gentle understanding. "Some days you might want to wear something soft to protect the areas that are healing, and some days you might prefer to let air reach your scalp to help with healing. The important thing is that you get to decide based on what feels good to you." The concept of personal choice about head covering was revolutionary for Diego, who had spent months having every aspect of his appearance controlled through systematic torture and intimidation within the trafficking network. Over the following days, Diego began the gradual process of physical and psychological recovery from organized trafficking trauma, though his healing would clearly require extensive specialized treatment and therapeutic support. The Santos family, trained in trafficking recovery and experienced with children surviving organized abuse, provided structure without control, offering Diego choices he had never been allowed to make while maintaining the specialized security protocols necessary for his protection. Rachel visited regularly as part of Diego's therapeutic team, providing ongoing trauma counseling while witnessing the remarkable transformation that freedom from trafficking and systematic torture created in a child who had been held captive through organized violence. Within the first week, Diego was asking questions about normal family life, expressing curiosity about children's rights, and beginning to display natural curiosity that had been suppressed under trafficking control. Most significantly, Diego began exploring his relationship with his own identity and cultural heritage, learning to separate his background from the criminal exploitation he had experienced, and understanding that his ethnicity was something to be proud of rather than something that made him vulnerable to trafficking operations. 2 weeks after his rescue, federal investigators brought news that ensured Diego's permanent safety while providing answers about his true family situation. Investigation had revealed that Diego had been kidnapped from his biological family in Mexico 2 years earlier and trafficked across the border specifically for exploitation, with the adults claiming to be his parents being criminal operatives rather than family members. More importantly for Diego's healing process, the investigation had located his real parents, Miguel and Carmen Morales, who lived in Guadalajara and had been searching desperately for their son since his disappearance. The family had been working with both Mexican and American authorities to locate Diego, never giving up hope that he would be found and returned safely. What this means, the specialized social worker explained to Diego in terms appropriate for his age and trauma history, is that you have real parents who love you very much and have been searching for you since you were taken from them. They have a safe home where you can finish healing, and they understand what happened to you and how to help you feel completely safe. When Diego was finally reunited with his biological parents, Miguel and Carmen, through video calls and later in person, his reaction was one of overwhelming relief and joy at reconnecting with family members who represented genuine love rather than the systematic exploitation he had experienced for 2 years. "Son, we've been searching for you everywhere," Carmen said tearfully during their first video reunion, her voice breaking with emotion as she saw her child alive, but clearly traumatized. "Your father and I never stopped looking, and now we're going to make sure you never have to be afraid or hide who you really are." 3 weeks after his rescue, Diego had begun displaying remarkable resilience and healing capacity that amazed even the specialized trauma professionals treating his trafficking recovery. His natural intelligence and cultural pride, which had been systematically suppressed by trafficking operations designed to break his identity, now flourished as he experienced genuine safety and family love. Rachel was completing her therapeutic documentation when Diego appeared in her office doorway one afternoon, now wearing a colorful traditional cap that his parents had sent him, a sight that filled her with profound therapeutic satisfaction and hope for his continued recovery. "Ms. Rachel, look what my real parents sent me." Diego displayed his new cap with obvious pride, demonstrating healthy connection to his cultural identity and comfort with his healing process. "They said I can choose to wear it because I like it, not because I have to hide something." The simple statement represented how much psychological healing had occurred, Diego understanding that his appearance was his choice and that his heritage was something to celebrate rather than something that made him vulnerable to exploitation. "That's a beautiful hat, Diego," Rachel said, feeling tears of joy at the complete transformation from a trafficking victim to a confident boy reconnecting with his cultural identity. "I'm so happy that you feel free to choose what makes you comfortable and proud of who you are." "My real parents say we're going to Mexico soon, where I can go to my real school and not worry about anyone trying to hurt me," Diego announced proudly, "and they promise that I'll never have to hide who I am or be scared of people who are supposed to take care of me." As Diego headed back to his classroom, moving with the confident stride of a child who had reclaimed his identity and safety, Rachel reflected on the transformation she'd witnessed. In just weeks, a trafficking victim had become someone who could express excitement about returning to his real family and genuine cultural identity. 6 months later, Rachel received a letter that filled her with therapeutic satisfaction and hope for other trafficking survivors. Diego had successfully returned to Mexico and was thriving with his biological family while receiving continued trauma therapy. His letter included photos of him participating in traditional celebrations and attending school with a full head of healthy hair, showcasing his complete physical and cultural healing. "Dear Ms. Rachel," Diego had written in careful English, "I wanted to thank you for helping me learn that I don't have to hide my real identity to be safe. My head healed completely, and I love being able to wear hats because I want to, as part of my culture. I'm helping other kids in Mexico understand that asking for help when someone hurts you is always the right thing to do, and that it's never your fault when bad adults do terrible things to you." Stories like these remind us that school counselors serve as crucial frontline defenders against organized trafficking and systematic abuse, combining therapeutic expertise with systematic observation to identify those suffering under the most sophisticated concealment operations. Every day, heroes like Rachel are making these life-saving discoveries through willingness to look beyond surface behaviors and investigate when children's protective actions suggest involvement in criminal exploitation requiring immediate specialized intervention. But how many children are still concealing evidence of trafficking and organized abuse behind innocent accessories, waiting for someone with the training and courage to discover the truth and coordinate the complex rescue operations they desperately need. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more powerful stories of rescue and redemption.